Twitter says no to political advertising. The social media platform imposes a ban ahead of next year's US presidential election. But how will this be enforced? And would it encourage or stifle political debate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, social media has transformed the way we debate politics, and no one knows that more than the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who often uses Twitter to announce new policies, attack opponents, or even retweet what many consider to be misleading information. And over the years, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have been criticised for allowing political hate speech and misinformation to flourish on their platforms. Now, with just a year to go before the US presidential election, Twitter is banning all political advertising around the world from next month. While some Democratic candidates welcomed the move, President Trump's campaign manager called it a very dumb decision intended to silence conservatives. Well, Twitter's CEO Jack Dorsey says this isn't about free expression. This is about paying for reach. And paying to increase the reach of political speech has significant ramifications that today's democratic infrastructure may not be prepared to handle. It's worth stepping back in order to address. Well, let's take a closer look at spending around social media ads in the United States. Now, political parties are expected to spend $6 billion ahead of next year's presidential election, but only about 20% of that will cover digital media. Most of the rest will go to television. Now, Twitter estimates that it earned $3 million from political ads during last year's midterm election. Now, that's not a huge amount. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris has spent more than $1 million on Twitter ads since last June. To put that into perspective, President Trump has spent less than $7,000. His campaign is more focused on Facebook, spending more than $21 million there. And Facebook says political advertising will account for about 0.5% of its revenue next year. Well, let's introduce today's panel. Joining us from the eastern Dutch city of Enschede, Philip Bray. He's a professor in philosophy at the University of Twente and an analyst on the philosophy of technology. In Philadelphia, that's Joe Watkins, a Republican political strategist. And also on Skype from Essex in the UK, that's Yair Cohen, who's an analyst on internet law and social media. Welcome to you all. Right, so to begin with, I think it's important to define what we see political advertising as being. So Jack Dorsey here is referring specifically to promoted tweets, so tweets that companies would then pay for when people engage with them. But it isn't just tweets that promote candidates that he's wanting to ban, it's also issue advertising as well. Yair, I'm going to start with you because that sounds very tricky. Where do you draw the line there?
I think you draw the line at the very okay. We need to go back to basics. We need to look at the mission statement of each of these organizations. So when you look at the mission statement, say, of Twitter, it is really to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly without barriers. In Twitter's view, paid political adverts could possibly create barriers to free speech. And also, they are not instantaneous. They are not immediate. They are speech that has been planned. And what Twitter is saying is if we are allowed this information to disseminate via paid advertising, it means that we are doing injustice to our own mission statement. So this is where we draw the line, where we know that the activity goes against what we believe in.
Well, let me throw this to you, Philip, because I want to dig into this idea of issue advertisements, right? So it's not just ads around candidates, but it's ads around issues. So any kind of promoted ad around a topic could potentially be banned here. What's your take on that, Philip?
Well, I mean, Twitter and other social media, they promote all kinds of speech, including political speech, and political advertising is a form of speech. These companies also allow other forms of advertising, so why not political advertising? It's a form of speech that, in my view, should be protected, especially on these large social media platforms that are used by millions, even billions of users.
Okay, so I feel like we're heading each other off here in terms of what is free speech. So what we're also talking about is paid speech. So at what point is paid speech free speech? Let me ask you that question, Joe.
I've been a candidate myself for political office. I've worked for a U.S. senator, and I worked in his campaign for the U.S. Senate, and he won. And I worked in a presidential campaign. I worked in a couple, and the first one I worked on, the candidate won the presidency and served in the White House, and I worked in his White House staff. I know the power of words, and I know the importance of freedom of information. I think that Twitter is probably trying to stop the flow of disinformation that many felt had an impact in the 2016 presidential campaign. So I think this is a move to try to stop the flow of disinformation from outside parties. But I'm not sure that it'll have the consequence, the desired effect, that is. At the end of the day, President Trump uses Twitter not for paid political ads, and you can see from how little he spends. He's probably not ever going to spend very much on political ads with Twitter, but he uses Twitter as a way to get information to millions of people in a matter of moments, and he's been very, very successful with it, and that won't stop. He'll continue to use it. He'll continue to dominate that platform and to move markets and also to move people using the Twitter platform. However, Twitter will take a small hit in terms of its unwillingness to pay for these, to allow for these paid ads, because it'll impact their balance sheet, but not much, but a little bit. And at the end of the day, it won't really disrupt much.
Joe, I'm going to come back to the numbers in just a moment, but I want to pick up on one of the things that you said there, because this refers to paid tweets, right? So, as you said, President Trump can continue tweeting on his own account if these aren't promoted tweets, and he has, I believe, something at the moment 66.4 million followers. And Twitter was his primary vehicle for communication in the lead up to the last election. So, despite the fact that this move does potentially favor incumbents, right? So Jack Dorsey has already said this. The Trump campaign has said that it's dumb. And then we've had mostly positive reactions from the Democratic side. So I'm curious, break that down for us, Joe. How will this affect campaigns leading up to the 2020 election?
Well, campaigns spend money on these political ads, these paid political ads, to influence people, and oftentimes the ads that they pay for are meant to cast their opponents in an unfavorable light. So these are very, very important, a very important tool for campaigns. They want to define their opponents before the opponents have a chance to define themselves, and they want to define the opponents in a negative way. And so that's how people in campaigns use paid political advertising. In this case, the Trump campaign would probably think this is obviously trying to slow them down, slow down the people who would, on their behalf, pay for these ads on Twitter. And so that's why the Trump campaign wouldn't like it. But on the other hand, it's not going to slow the president down from being able to get his message out on Twitter to millions of Americans across the United States and also people around the world.
Well, so one of the arguments against doing this ban is related to this, because we've heard also from civil society groups that it could damage people who aren't necessarily in the media spotlight, so lessen the voices of smaller candidates, perhaps, or affect the voices of other advocacy groups, right? So I know Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, who doesn't agree with this. He's said that ads are an important part of voice. Who does this hurt the most, Philip?
Well, it hurts, most of all, it hurts political discourse, and it hurts democracy, because for a well-functioning democracy, you need political speech, and that includes paid political speech. And it's very unfortunate to have this ban, because it also affects the reason that Jack Dorsey wants this is he says there's so much false and misleading information out there in political advertising. And he says it challenges civic discourse and democratic infrastructures. So that may all be true, but by banning all political advertising as a result, including the ones that are not false and misleading, you're throwing out the child with the bathwater. and you're still allowing the unpaid false and misleading speech. So you're still having that problem. Now, what Mark Zuckerberg is proposing to just keep airing these political ads with no interference, whether they're misleading or false or not, is also completely the wrong approach, because then you reward misinformation campaigns and have the negative consequences that Jack Dorsey warns about. So we need to find a middle ground between banning all political ads and just allowing all political ads.
Yeah, I want to ask you to respond to what Philip was just saying there. Is this throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or is this a protection of free speech?
I think there is a fundamental difference between free speech and paid speech. These two things are not the same. Free speech means that speech is free for everyone, so everyone can express themselves in a way which is equal, and whoever wants to listen to the speech can listen to the speech. Whoever doesn't want to listen to the speech does not have to listen to speech. With paid speech, paid advertising means that first, people who are able to afford to pay for more advertising, their voice will be heard louder. But also, it means that we are forcing speech upon people who might not necessarily want to hear that speech. So it is okay if you're a follower of an individual, whether it is the United States president or anybody else, and you're willing to hear what they have to say. Or if you really don't want to hear that kind of stuff, but it is forced upon you because that individual had paid for advertising. So I think that the simplicity of the phrase free speech need to be looked at in a little bit more detail here.
Well, yeah. Speaking of paid speech, I want to look at some of these figures. So I know there are some discrepancies about reporting and who spent what and where, and what's classified as political ads. But let's take some numbers here from the US Federal Election Commission. And it says since 2008, and that's really the birth of social media in terms of political campaigning, campaigns have spent something like $46 million on Facebook, $30 million on Google, and they've spent less than $2 million on Twitter. So we're really not talking about huge amounts of cash here for Twitter. So is this, and I'm going to ask this question to Joe, is this rather a savvy, strategic business decision on the part of Twitter to set itself apart from Facebook?
It may be. It may be a savvy, it may be meant to be a savvy business decision on the part of Twitter to set themselves apart from Facebook. But at the end of the day, it, like I said earlier, it may not have the desired end. And that is because, again, when you consider what political advertising is, if you're a candidate, and this is why it favors incumbents and it disfavors people who are new to the process. If I'm a brand new candidate running for the United States Senate in the United States, and I want to tell people about myself so they know who I am so they can vote for me, I have to buy paid political advertising to do that. I've got to buy an ad that says, I'm Joe Watkins, this is where I'm from, this is what I've done, and this is why you need to vote for me. And to not be able to do that, just it favors the incumbent, it favors the person who's already there. And they don't have to do anything more because they're already there, they already have a record, and people already know who they are. But for me, as a new person, and people don't know who I am, it puts me at a distinct disadvantage. And so it doesn't have the consequence, the intended end that Twitter might be aiming for. If they're aiming to kind of do away or discourage disinformation or misinformation, it probably won't get that done, and it certainly won't allow for a leveling of the playing field with regards to candidates.
Well, I suspect this wasn't just about misinformation for Twitter. It also potentially was about trying to set itself apart within the social media sphere. And I see that the timing of all of this announcement, it came literally as Mark Zuckerberg was announcing some pretty good earnings data for Facebook. And that doesn't seem to be much of a coincidence. So I do want to play you something here, because Mark Zuckerberg has been under fire for allowing political advertisements with misinformation to continue existing on Facebook, right? But last week, he did give a speech at Georgetown. Let's have a listen to what he said.
We're at another crossroads. We can either continue to stand for free expression, understanding its messiness, but believing that the long journey towards greater progress requires confronting ideas that challenge us. Or we can decide that the cost is simply too great. I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians or the news in a democracy. And we are not an outlier here. The other major internet platforms and the vast majority of media also run these same ads.
So, Philip, I'm going to ask you to respond to that. Presumably, you do agree with Zuckerberg there.
Well, I agree with the sentiment, but with the decision to allow for that free speech also comes responsibility. And I think that both Twitter and Facebook are abdicating that responsibility. Twitter, by simply banning all political advertising, including the ones that are not based on misinformation, and Facebook by allowing advertising that is false and misleading. Real responsibility in this matter for social media companies would be to actually function as a genuine arbiter in that respect. They have to do fact-checking and allow those political advertisements that are accurate and disallow those that are part of a disinformation campaign.
Well,
and they can do so. They can do so with through nonpartisan fact-checking organizations.
Okay, because I do want to talk about enforcement of all of this, right? Because even with this ban, I imagine you could pay influencers who have lots of followers on Twitter to tweet and engage with people online without necessarily using these promoted tweets. And we also know that there's this large network of bots, right, on Twitter. Could we then perhaps see a resurgence of those? Let me throw that to you, Yair.
I think the problem for Mr. Zuckerberg first is that if Facebook is taking an approach where it does censor certain accounts and it does certain voices, then it cannot then turn around and say, well, we will be censored and do fact checking, but we will exclude from this process politicians only, because there are other political ideas and other political values that are not necessarily being promoted by people who call themselves politicians. And I think this is where the real problem is. So you have to choose either or. Either we are going to get engaged in censorship and fact checking, and then decide who we're going to ban, who we're going to not ban, or we want nothing to do with it. We will just allow people to say whatever they want to say. Everyone is equal, and then let the people judge who they believe and let them make up their own mind, because people aren't stupid. And I think that Twitter is taking the approach of trusting the people to make the right decision. So people quite often are able to recognize whether there is a bot involved, whether they become a subject of a campaign. People are quite smart, and they don't really need Facebook to tell them what they need to listen to and what they don't need to listen to.
Well, then let me ask you a little more about the protection of people's information, right? Oh, okay. Let me ask you to respond to that then, Philip. You're shaking your head there.
I just want to say that this is not what empirical studies show. Studies show that people are often not able to recognize fake news, and even often assign more credibility to fake news that is well crafted than to real news. So I think there is a real problem that people cannot often recognize this fake information. And this goes to the heart of the matter. It's not about paid political speech or unpaid speech. It's about how to deal with massive amounts of false and misleading political speech on social media platforms. And my answer to that is the only solution is that social media companies, they don't do bans of all speech. They don't allow all speech. They have to be arbiters through fact-checking. That's the only solution.
Well, picking up on that, just today, Facebook suspended 3 accounts linked to Russian interference that were involved in trying to influence voters in African countries. So, I mean, that is definitely an ongoing trend that we see. Sorry, Yair, please do jump in there.
I think there is something slightly patronizing about this approach that Big Brother knows best, and people aren't as clever as we think they are. And although I accept that there are some studies, I sometimes doubt the conclusions and the way those studies are being conducted and who's been paying for those studies and for that research. And I think in democracy, at least, we have to give people the credit they deserve. We cannot possibly place an organization such as Facebook or any other corporate body to make decision for the people. I trust the people, and I think that we all have a lot of faith in the people. People aren't as stupid as some people think they are. I think the public tends to come to the right decision, and then for someone to turn around and say, well, they only came to this conclusion because they've not been clever enough, they've been unduly influenced by bots or by robots or by some political campaigning which has been gone wrong. I think there's something slightly patronizing about this approach, and I don't really accept that.
I don't think it's patronizing. I think it's normal. I mean, we ask the same of the labeling of products, that they don't contain false information about the number of calories or the chemical ingredients. And you can have the same request of political advertising. I think it's a normal thing.
Well, so let me throw this idea out here, because there has been this suggestion, because we already see that promoted tweets, some of them are targeted at specific people, right? So Twitter's used its algorithms and worked out who should see these tweets. And some are arguing that companies should focus on restricting the use of personal data in the targeting of these ads rather than banning all ads entirely. Joe, do you think there's any value in that?
Well, maybe there's some value in it. I think that the issue becomes is to what degree should these companies police the ads that they get paid to put on their platforms, and that's a question that I think will be answered in time. A lot of the advertising now is very sophisticated. It's extraordinarily sophisticated. So while it may have the outward appearance of being very simple and straightforward, many of these ads are highly sophisticated to reach a particular audience and to move an audience in one direction or another. So this is all very hard stuff. At what point do you stifle freedom of speech in favor of stopping the spread of false information? I don't know that you can actually do that, and I think that Zuckerberg is probably errs on the right side of this by saying, you know what, we're gonna allow these ads on our platform and let the chips fall where they may. At least people can be heard. The good people, along with maybe the people who don't have good intentions, can be heard, and we'll leave it to the consumer to kind of figure it out. Maybe there's a need for some more policing on their part, but it's awfully hard to police. I mean, how do you police? If I'm a candidate running, if you've got 100 candidates running for office, how do you police what's being said about them? If somebody makes an accusation that I did something, how does any company, any social platform police that? It becomes very, very difficult, very, very nitpicky, and very, very hard to arrive at what the truth is.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw a last very quick question to you, Philip, because we are running out of time. Do you think that this ban potentially encourages political debate, or does it stifle it?
It could. Well, I don't think it has a big implications for the normal use of Twitter, of course, which also includes political discourse. So at least it doesn't ban political discourse on Twitter, which is a good thing, of course. It bans some form of it, which I think I don't agree with. Instead of having the ban, you want to have all the messiness that the policing brings. And I agree that it's a messy thing to do, but the alternatives to either ban speech or allow any speech, however false and misleading the campaign is, those are not the answers.
Well, what it has done, it has certainly encouraged an interesting political debate amongst us today. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to all our guests, Philip Bray, Joe Watkins, and Yair Cohen, for being with us today on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation, actually, on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasia Tay, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.